Hey guys, today I will be talking about which tier 10 cruiser you should grind out first, since we now have 6 in World of Warships. All with differing strengths and weaknesses. I will go over the grind and what is the strengths and weaknesses of each tier 10 cruiser, along with whether I think you should grind them out or not. Now, just to preface, I am primarily a battleship main, or used to be, but due to the nature of battleships becoming more and more relevant with every patch, with cruisers such as the Henri coming out, I would strongly advise against grinding out a battleship at this point in time, until they receive major buffs or cruisers receive major nerfs. So to start off, I have all 6 of the tier 10 cruisers. We will start with the Zhao. To talk about the grind, we start out with Chikuma, which is a shitty little tier 2. Tenryu is a moderately fun little tier 3 that plays a lot like a destroyer with relatively good torps for the tier. You then move on to Kuma, which some people swear by, but the biggest issue for me is the fact that your bow is 10 millimeters thick, which means every 152 millimeter gun will overmatch your bow, but you only have 140 millimeter guns, which means your guns are not 14.3 times bigger than the thickness of the armor covering most tier 4 cruisers on the front, which is 10 millimeters, which means this ship is, in my opinion, generally a piece of shit. Next, we move on to the Furutaka, which is a powerhouse for the tier, with being the first cruiser in the game to get 203mm guns at this low of a tier. It has relatively good armor, and once you get the upgraded hull, it gets 2 forward-firing dual turrets. It's relatively good at spamming HE, and it's basically an Aoba at tier 5, with the added benefit of being covered in this 25mm of armor, which means any 14-inch gun that hits you here when you're angled, say, like this, as long as they don't hit your bow, they're going to auto-ricochet off of you, which is fantastic. Next, we move on to the Aoba, which is just a Furutaka now, but up-tiered with an AA ability. You get worse torpedo placement. They now can only fire backwards, versus where on Furutaka they could fire forwards, nearly. And generally it's a downgrade. You do get slightly better rate of fire though, but it's generally a piece of shit. Next we move on to the Miyoko, where you start to get really good solid armor, which is 102 millimeters thick over the main belt, and you get this 32 millimeters of deck armor, which is fantastic for when you're getting shot at. This means that any gun, bar the Yamato, will not be able to overmatch your deck and will auto ricochet. And again, you have the nice 25 millimeters of side armor a couple tiers early compared to most other cruisers, which allows you to ricochet 14-inch shells off of it. Next, move on to the Mogami, which, forget the 203s don't exist. The 155s with IFHE and Demolition Expert are incredibly powerful and allow you to go through all ships with 32 millimeters of bow armor, assuming you have IFHE, which most ships at tier 8 and above are absolutely covered in 32 millimeters of armor. Next, we move on to the Ibuki. It's an alright ship. You get the nice ability to fire 6 guns forward at ranges in excess of 16 kilometers, and the ship is really nice because you get decently long range and you get fairly good torpedoes. Next, we move on to the Zhao, which in my opinion is no longer the best tier 10 cruiser in the game. It used to be, but no longer. Generally with the Zhao, you have extremely troll armor. You have the thickest forward armor in the game for when you go bow in. Any gun 32 millimeters, or any gun up to 457 millimeters will not be able to do anything to your armor belts or to your deck, which can make Zhao's armor extremely troll. You also have Turtleback covering a Ghetto Turtleback covering the center of your ship, which can be extremely effective at times. And if a ship hits this sloped part of your armor, it will generally auto ricochet. and just do pen damage as opposed to citadel damage. The downside to the Zhao at this point is you now have slower rate of fire. Granted, you have the best fire setting potential in the game, but it has been outclassed by the introduction of newer and newer ships and is no longer the king of tier 10. I would rank it at 3rd place out of the 6 ships at tier 10. Next we move on to the Des Moines, which is an absolute monster after recent buffs. But now to go on to the grind, we start out with the Chester, which is again just a piece of shit tier 2. You move on to the St. Louis, which is an incredibly powerful seal clubbing ship because you get turtleback armor at this tier, which is very effective. We then move on to the Phoenix, where you have absolutely no armor, except you're safe from Kuma's guns, and you do have the 152mm guns, which allow you to overmatch the bows of other tier 4 cruisers. We then move on to the Omaha, which suffers from the same issue of only 10mm of bow armor. Same as the Phoenix, only 10mm of bow armor, which means any 150mm gun is just going to absolutely ruin your day, on top of an extremely large citadel. We then move on to the Cleveland, which some people swear by. It used to be better when it had a separated citadel, but they removed that and gave it a flat citadel that is now extremely low in the water. You get good rate of fire guns, you get 12 of them. Only issue with the Cleveland is that you're always up tiered into tier 8. We then move on to the New Orleans, which was recently buffed, and this flat out has the best armor piercing at tier 7. You can do extremely well against angled targets, and people hate on this ship because they complain that they get nuked when they go broadside, which is just, it's your fault if you get nuked going broadside. But the ship is extremely quick and maneuverable, with relatively good speed and relatively good rudder shift, especially once you upgrade the hull. You drop it down to 7 seconds, throw the rudder shift mod on. You're looking at a 5.5 second rudder shift, extremely strong ship. We then move on to the New Orleans, where you get relatively thick side armor, but the issue with the New Orleans is the fact that it's a very underwhelming ship. Your HE's meh, your AP, the gimmick of having really good AP doesn't carry on to this tier. Your AA isn't even the best at this tier for the cruisers, even though it's USN. It's just overall a lackluster ship. Moving on to the Baltimore, you're completely plated in 27mm of bow armor, which means you can go bow in to ships with 15-inch guns, and they cannot do shit to you. You have really good armor piercing once you get the upgraded guns, but your arcs become a lot worse, but you get a massive buff to your reload time. You can get a Baltimore's rate of fire with the reload mod down to 8 seconds, which is very respectable for a tier 9 cruiser, and you get the best AA out of all the cruisers at tier 9, with the exception of Neptune, but this is cruisers with an anti-air ability. Moving on to Des Moines, an absolute powerhouse. You get the 27mm of plating all over. It was recently buffed. This plate used to be 27mm, which meant 16-inch guns could overmatch your deck, but they removed that by making it 30mm thick. You have exceptionally fast rate of fire with 5.5 second reload. You have relatively good stealth. You have radar that, with the radar module, which goes in your final slot, you get a 56-second radar at the expense of losing some concealment, which is totally worth it. Des Moines, I would rank 4th place out of the 6 tier 10 cruisers. Mind you, all of the tier 10 cruisers are incredibly strong. All of them I would gladly take over a battleship at this point in time. But I would rate Des Moines at 4th place out of them all. Moving on to the Moskva, in my opinion, 2nd best cruiser in the game. To talk about the grind. Novik. Basically the theme with all these tier 2 cruisers is they're all pieces of shit. Bogatyr is a relatively good seal clubber because you get the dual turret. It's basically the same ship as an Oleg, which is now a premium. The only issue with this ship is that you have absolutely no armor compared to a St. Louis. The Svetlana has relatively good armor. You can bounce any shell in the game off this lower part of your bow, and you can bounce all 14-inch guns off the midsection of your bow, but the upper section is going to let you down. The issue with Svetlana is, like the Kuma, you have tiny guns, but the benefit of this is if you are a SEAL Clubber and you have AFT and basic firing training, these guns get the added benefit of that. Moving on to the Kirov hands down has the best guns at tier 5, although they have a really slow rate of fire. You have next to no armor, but luckily you do have 13mm of bow armor, which means that you can auto-ricochet 152mm guns, which you will run into a lot. You have exceptionally strong AP on the Kirov, relatively good HE, slow rate of fire, but exceptionally good muzzle velocity, and you get 16.3 kilometer range on top of a scout plane, which means this is an exceptionally good long-range HE spamming ship. And assuming you make use of the 35.5 knot top speed, you can stay at max range spamming HE and spreading the balance to your comrades. Moving on to the Budyonny, you again only have 13mm of bow armor, which is weaker than the Cleveland, which is an issue because any 203mm shell is going to punch through this like it's cheese, but you have exceptionally good armor over your turrets and off your belt, which means if you angle the ship at this type of angle, you will be incredibly effective against tanking battleship shells. The occasional battleship shell will go through your bow and strike this part of your armor, but thanks to it being 140mm thick, it's highly unlikely that they'll pen. Very good ship if you get IFHE on it. It'll make you want to get tier 8 games. Moving on to the Shores, you finally get enough armor to ricochet 203mm shells. You get shitty side armor, but as long as you stay angled like this, battleships are going to struggle to citadel you unless they get lucky and hit your bow. One added benefit of the Shores is you have the 12 guns, all with exceptional rate of fire and with exceptional range, 16.8 kilometers. Again, with a scout plane, you can spam HE from an exceptionally far range. Moving on to the Chapayev, this is an exceptionally good ship at spamming HE. You get really good AP compared to the Shores and the Budyonny. You get covered in 25mm of armor, which means that all 14-inch shells and below will automatically ricochet off of you if you're heavily angled. If you stay angled like this, again, battleships can't do much to you. This is the first ship on the Russian line to get radar, although it's short, but it's the same radar that you'll end up with on the Moskva. And again, you get exceptionally good range at 17.3 kilometers, which you're going to want to make use of because, again, the ship is an exceptional ship for staying at max range and spamming HE. On to one of the best ships in the line, you have the Dmitry Donskoy. If you stay at angles, again, you start to get really good armor here because if you angle like this, battleships struggle to pen you, and then if they do hit you, the issue is this 35mm of belt armor means that they will auto ricochet off of that unless they get lucky, unless you over angle like this. You get 180mm guns with exceptionally good AP performance and exceptionally high velocity on top of, with the range mod, you get 20 kilometer range, 20.1. You get good armor over the turrets. You get, again, the armor that can, at this point, you don't really run into anything with 14-inch guns anymore at this tier. We may see something different with the British cruisers, but you get 180mm guns with IFH. When you stack IFHE on top of that, you will have 38mm of penetration with HE, which means that you'll be able to cheese through most of the armor on USN battleships, which is fantastic. And this is the last Russian ship you're going to want to get IFHE on. Moving on to the Moskva, you have the weak 25mm of bow armor, but instead, the added benefit is you get 50mm of side armor on the upper belt, which means nothing can overmatch that, as well as on the deck, which protects you from almost everything in the game except Henri's HE and Battleship HE. This side armor is exceptionally good at bow tanking. Well, not necessarily bow tanking, but when you angle the Moskva like this, it can be exceptionally hard to pen. But if your enemies know where to shoot, they will shoot you here, which most don't, which in that case they have to go through this 170mm plate, but which can really give tier 8 battleships a hard time, but once you get into the tier 9 and 10 battleships, they're going to easily go through this. I would rate Moskva as the second best ship in the game for tier 10 cruisers. Moving on to the Hindenburg, I think that in my opinion, the Hindenburg is tied with the Zhao as the third best tier 10 cruiser. Reason being, we'll get to that in a bit. Again, now onto the grind. Dresden, piece of shit, tier 2 cruiser, no armor. Kolberg, again, no armor. You don't get torpedoes on this ship, which means, like most other tier 3 cruisers, which means you're at a huge disadvantage when you fight them, and you're absolute cheese for any 152mm gun that hits you. Moving on to the Karlsruhe, a semi-decent ship. If you go bow in, you have this 60mm plate and this 30mm plate, which means nothing at the tier is going to be able to damage you. The only issue with this is you can bring hardly any guns to bear, but relatively good armor if you angle like this, as well as you get torpedoes. And the guns are very lackluster, but they get the job done. Moving on to the Königsberg, the specialty of the Königsberg is these back two turrets can completely traverse, so they don't have to do a 180 to turn around, so you can almost always have them on target. Königsberg, the main issue is you have next to no armor. You do have this nice section right here that will prevent you from being citadeled, but the instant anyone shoots your upper bow, they're going to shoot you for full pen damage, assuming they have a 150mm gun or bigger. Moving on to the Nuremberg, you get 16mm bow armor, which is exceptionally useful because now you can ricochet 152mm guns as well as 203mm guns. You have a relatively small citadel, but if you go broadside, you will be punished. The citadel, you can't really see it, but it does run all along under here. It can be useful because if you're at close range, you want to go completely broadside, and you're getting shot at by battleship caliber guns. If you go completely broadside, they're highly likely to overpen. You no longer have the 360-degree turret traverse, but you now have exceptionally good rate of fire on your guns with a 6-second reload, and you have 16.5 kilometer range, which means you can stay at max range and spam HE exceptionally well. You get decent German torpedoes. These are the same torpedoes that you have all the way up the line. Moving on to the York, you get 210mm guns, which are fairly lackluster. They're relatively good at HE spam, but the specialty of the York is you have this 25mm, like the Miyoko, you have this 25mm armor belt, which means if you angle like this, you can be fairly effective at bouncing battleship caliber shells, assuming they're under 14 inches. And again, if you get caught broadside at close range, you can expect to have them overpen you, and this armor can be somewhat effective against lower tiered cruisers shooting at you with armor piercing if you get caught broadside due to the turtleback, but I wouldn't count on it to save you. Moving on to the Admiral Hipper, this is where you start to get truly effective turtleback against battleships up close and cruisers up close. Unless they're USN cruisers, then their high arcs mean that they go straight through your armor, because they come down an angle like this, which basically ignores the turtleback. You are covered in 27mm of bow armor, which means that tier 10 battleships with 15-inch guns can't do much to you. And if you're completely bow in like this, it's exceptionally hard to citadel the Hipper bow in because you have to hit underneath the waterline, which is hard to hit. And nothing except 16-inch guns can go through this upper bow in terms of armor piercing. Again, you can angle relatively effectively against battleships by going like this. You can count on this armor to ricochet shells. And the nice thing about Hipper is you have exceptionally good range. If this would ever disappear. You have exceptionally good range at 17.7 kilometers, which means you can be absolutely fantastic at spamming HE from long range, especially if you spec the German guns for HE. Moving on to the Rune, you get upgraded fire chance over the Hipper, you get better rate of fire. You lose some of that forward bow protection, but You gain a significant amount of armor. On top of that, you have all your you have triple turrets now. You have 3 of them for 9 guns as opposed to 8. The ship is very good at running away. Again, you can angle to battleships like this and be relatively safe, and 15-inch guns can't really hurt you. And onto the Hindenburg, you have the armor profile is basically the exact same as the runes. You have the excellent turtleback protecting you from battleship AP and cruisers up close, and you have exceptionally good range at 17.8 kilometers. With the Hindenburg, you don't want to run the range mod because you can drastically increase your DPM by running the reload mod, and your turret traverse won't suffer. With the expert marksman, it still maintains 23-second rudder turret rotation, which is fantastic. You have 30 millimeters of deck armor protecting you from 16-inch shells. I rate this at 3rd because it's just as effective as Zhao at spamming HE, because yes, you don't have that massive fire chance, but you do have volume of shells. Moving on to the Minotaur, this is in my opinion the worst tier 10 cruiser, just due to the fact that while I'll get onto that. Onto the grind. The tier 2, shit. The tier 3, shit. The tier 4, shit. The tier 5, shit. Tier 6, people say is decent. I disagree. Only having 8 guns at tier 2 is not good. Moving on to Fiji, the ship is incredibly powerful. You have no armor to speak of, and 203mm guns can overmatch your bow. But you have smokescreen, you have a heal, you have the same guns as you get on the tier 8, and against tier 7 and 7 to 8 opponents, the Fiji is incredibly dangerous. You get decent torpedoes that go 8 kilometers and are relatively fast and have a relatively quick reload. And that's pretty much it for the ship. Moving on to the Edinburgh, you get enough armor to ricochet 203mm shells off your bow. You, again, no armor to really speak of beyond that. You get the exact same guns. You get slightly better torpedoes that go an extra 2 kilometers. You get the same range. The only difference is that now you are bigger and you get the British heal, which allows you to heal back a huge amount of HP. But that doesn't really matter because the ship is just a straight downgrade from the tier 7. It's basically the tier 7 with a better heal, except now you have to fight tier 10s. Moving on to the Neptune, this is in my opinion the strongest ship in the line due to being able to get 19.5 kilometer range when spec'd properly, which means at those extreme ranges you can get pen damage through the decks because your shells fall at a good enough trajectory with amazing British auto bounce angles to be able to get deck pens, which means the ship is extremely lethal at extreme ranges. You finally get workable torpedoes. I wouldn't suggest researching this unless you plan to keep this as your primary ship, and this ship has the best AA in the game overall for anything without a defensive fire ability. As long as you run it with manual AA, your secondary guns also are benefited by it, so its overall AA is significantly better than Minotaur's. And moving on to Minotaur, you get excellent rate of fire, excellent turret traverse, good torpedoes, same ones as on the Neptune. But the issue with Minotaur is there's a lot of radar ships at tier 10. The ship is still incredibly powerful, but for me it's a bit too situational to be usable in every situation. I would rate this as the worst of the tier 10 cruisers. Although when fighting the people say it's an excellent DD killer, but the issue is if a DD goes bow in at this tier, you're just going to auto ricochet off of it, and you're only going to be able to do superstructure damage. And yes, while you can rip them apart if they go broadside, it's dependent on the skill of the British cruiser player, or of the destroyer, whether you can actually take them out effectively. And finally, on to what I now consider to be the best tier 10 cruiser, the Henri. To talk about the grind, the Jurian, meh. Friant, meh. The line is very lackluster until you get to tier 5. Once you get to tier 5, you get the Emil Burton. The issue with this ship is you have no armor, but at the same time, that issue is its greatest strength because having destroyer levels of armor means almost everything overpins you, with the exception of other British cruisers, or with British cruisers. You have guns that handle more like a tier 10 than a tier 5. They have exceptionally good turret traverse at 15 seconds. And again, having no armor is fantastic. You also get fantastic 9-kilometer torpedoes at tier 5. And you get relatively good range at 14.9 kilometers. The tier 6, you have the exact same guns as the tier 5, but better rate of fire. You now get enough armor to ricochet 203mm shells off your bow. The ship is relatively effective at tanking battleship shells if you angle it like this. They will do a lot of pen damage to you, but it's highly unlikely that they'll citadel you. You get the exact same torpedoes all the way through the line, except with this one you only get 2. The Augury is, in my opinion, the worst tier 7 cruiser, simply because there's nothing really fancy about the ship apart from the speed boost that the tier 6 also gets. You get decent side armor, but it's the same armor that basically every other tier 7 has. You get relatively good armor over the guns, but in general, it's just a very lackluster ship. There's nothing really special about it. It's not a bad ship, but not shining in any areas doesn't help it out. Moving on to the Charles Martel, you get the 25mm of armor all over, which means 14-inch guns can't do anything to you. This ship is better than the New Orleans, but worse than the Mogami and the Chapayev, in my opinion. It's still better than the Edinburgh. Again, you can angle the battleships like this relatively effectively. The issue with this ship being that it's not fast enough to really be on par with the other British cruisers. Moving on to the St. Louis, you get more of the same. It's basically the same ship as the Charles Martel, but a higher tier. You get relatively good range, which you can get to over 21 kilometers if you put the range extending mod on for the 3 million credits, which means you're exceptionally good at spamming HE from long range. And onto the Henri, which is, in my opinion, the best tier 10 cruiser in the game, simply due to these guns. Well, not only the guns and the speed are why I think this is the best tier 10 cruiser in the game. The benefits of the Henri is you have this 30mm of side armor, which you will take a lot of damage from 203mm HE shells, but you will auto-ricochet anything but a Yamato shell off your side armor at this kind of angle. Also, the deck was buffed from 25mm to 30mm, so that now 16-inch shells can't do anything to your deck. You have exceptionally good armor. If you look here, you have the 19 on the outside, and then you have 140 on the inside, stacked on top of 45mm of armor. And you have the spaced armor bit, which means that a lot of shells, if they do manage to penetrate at long range, will detonate in that area, making it exceptionally hard to citadel this ship at long range. Now, onto the second best aspect of this ship, which is these guns. With IFHE, you get 52mm of penetration, which means you can go straight through the deck of almost every battleship in the game, as well as the Moskva, and you can cheese through the cab's armor, which is known to be exceptionally powerful and strong against cruisers because they can't penetrate it reliably. And now onto the best aspect of this ship, which is the speed boost. The ship's normal speed is 35 knots. I don't believe I have speed flags on anymore. No. With speed flags, it goes up to 38.6 knots, which means that with the speed boost, you can get your speed up to 43.9 knots, which means you go exceptionally quickly. And the reason why I enjoy this so much is simply because the ship can move around the battlefield. You aren't limited to one section of the battlefield. Having this amazing speed and decent... The AA, it's lackluster, but as long as you have the go fuck you CV button, it doesn't really matter. But the nicest thing about the speed boost is it lasts for 4.5 minutes. You can move around you don't feel confined to one area of the map. If one flank starts to falter, you can quickly turn around and switch to another side of the map. You get, with reload mod, you get a 10.8 second reload, which is really good considering how much damage these guns do with their exceptional penetration and 23% fire chance even with IFHE. This is just an exceptionally good all-around ship that can do absolutely everything. You are good at battle tank. You can tank battleship shells off your side armor, assuming they can hit you because this thing is so damn hard to hit. You have relatively good turret armor. You have exceptionally good speed. If British cruisers hit this part of your armor, no matter what happens, they cannot damage you. They can damage you if they hit here, but assuming they hit here, they can't damage you at all. And overall, the grind up to the ship can be annoying, but if you're looking for the hands down most competitive tier 10 cruiser, I would recommend the Henri. If you're looking for the most fun cruiser to play, I would recommend Des Moines or Hindenburg. If you want the most noob friendly tier 10 cruiser, I would recommend the Moskva. If you want to just set the world on fire, I would recommend Zhao. And for your first cruiser line to grind, I would strongly recommend the German cruisers or the American cruisers due to the relatively difficult grind, simply because it will prepare you and teach you to dodge shells, which is essential with all tier 10 cruisers. You need to be able to avoid fire and learn to mitigate damage. So the first line I would personally grind would be the Henri, but if you're just starting out in the game, I would strongly recommend Des Moines or Hindenburg. Thank you for watching, and that'll be all.